So this is part 2 of my commentary on chapter 21 of the Proverbs. I finished last time with verse 3. It took quite some time to finish that verse. And so I'd like now to move on to verse 4. An high look and a proud heart, and the plowing of the wicked is sin. So what can we make of this verse? An high look and a proud heart. Now I'd like to start with a proud heart and then maybe return to a high look. A proud heart is something that we are not strangers to at this point in the Proverbs. Of course, the common phrase, pride comes before the fall. There is great danger when one considers the relationship of the self to the world, how one is internally constituted. Pride in some sense means to be satisfied, but more than that, it is to revel in, to take a lofty, or to have a lofty opinion of one's own successes or of one's behavior. And I often wonder if it is pride in totality that is irredeemable, that it's sort of a negative characteristic, or if there's an aspect of it that man can use practically and safely. And I do think that there is an element, the element that we all are conscious of our own dignity. We all have some understanding of the worth that is afforded to an individual. In the Western world, I think we put a large emphasis on the plight of the individual and the individual's experience. The difficulty comes in when we misattribute or falsely attribute our satisfaction or pleasure that is directed towards the self in an improper place. What do I mean by that? Well, if we imagine the self, I like to imagine the self, I've used a number of different analogies, but one of the constant ones that I've used is that of an ancient city that has a wall around it. It has many different gates, many different entry points. But the general point being that the city is a place in and of itself. It is an identity in and of itself. There's a boundary that separates it from the outside world, or from the more suburban people, or rural people, or from the barbarians that live, again, another common expression, outside of the gates. Now, there are various reasons that a city can exist. There are various reasons that one might wish to identify a city or identify with a city. But there are also dangers that can occur within the city that can lead to, because of the proximity of the various agents that participate to make up the city can go astray. It can be it could be consumed by corruption, consumed by greed, or by disease, perhaps. Whatever the case, pride is a restriction of access. at least in the beginning, it is a restriction of access, the beginning of my definition here, as it relates to my illustration. Restriction of access such that the gates of the city remain closed in most instances, unless something benefits, or unless there is another eye to perhaps to witness the glory of the city, then the gates are open to it. But because the gates are closed so frequently, so often, the city becomes internalized. Hyperbolic comes to mind, or exaggerated. That the worth of the city is greater than the city attributes to itself. Another example of this, contemporary example, I think, is the modern-day experience in the United States, in which we are severely extended financially. And yet there is this opinion, this belief, that the state, that the country more broadly, occupies a special position in the world. Now, it occupies a particular position, but I think the uniqueness comes into question when the value that is attributed to it is not commensurate with the position that it holds. And in cases of this overextension, the view of such behavior, while it may be pleasing to the entity within, it is certainly anything but to those without. It appears narcissistic, conceited, selfish, misplaced, misunderstood, ignorant. As with many things, I think the context or the related factors in which something is to be is important to determine if something is just. And in the case of pride, I think, upon reflection here, it is possible to, as I have said, recognize one's own self-worth in a way that is not overextended, that one can have an accurate assessment of that value. Now, I think it would be quite something if an individual had the capacity to examine the self so honestly that they were able to place an accurate value of that self to themselves. I think it often requires some external input in order for the self to gain information that is not polluted by potential, I want to say bias, but there is that that risk for potential bias. But also, it's more than that, because the bias comes from a particular place. One is biased because they are blinded by their own viewpoint. They're blinded by their own walls. In the case of the city, they're blinded by the very lens through which they see. And as such, it is sometimes, I think, required to hear external input to modify and maintain that honesty, and I suppose we can even say modesty. Now, in the negative end, I have discussed a little bit about the potential dangers of that insular nature of the opinion of self, the overinflation of what we might call the ego in relationship to our achievements in life. And I'm interested in the downstream effects that an overinflation in one's ego may have. Surely I can think of many different cases. I can think of cases in which people have an overinflated sense of self, but also achieve quite a bit because of their confidence. But I suppose confidence and the overinflated sense of self are not entirely as interlinked as I think that they might be. Confidence based on a falsehood, I think, can lead to good outcomes. But it's a wonder. Sometimes in my mind, what flashed before me, an image was a house that is sitting upon a rotten beam, and it's only a matter of time before the house collapses or that beam gives way. And one must wonder in what cases and in what situations does that rotten beam of the self cave in? And what exactly might that look like? Well, certainly the confidence would be destroyed at the outset. But I think there's something more fundamental here. And it's something that I've talked about before. But it is the root, the pillar of the word value itself. This idea of deservedness or worth, importance, usefulness. A lot of this, again, Herodotus comes to mind here. Custom is the king of all men. To a certain degree, time, I think, has this limiting factor on man's perception. This is something that I've talked about in detail in the last episode, but part of man's condition, and part of the reason I think that in Genesis he is considered to be a fallen being, is because of the restraints that are placed on his experience, the constraints that are placed on his existence. Now, of course, his existence is at a certain level, and based on that level, he is afforded certain things, but also he is asked, I suppose, certain things. And this ask is somewhat of a sacrifice. But it's not as easy as some other things may be to consider exactly what the sacrifice is, or to hear what the question or what the ask is, the declaration of that ask, the requirement to man's existence. For I think it is not a simple matter. Man's judgment is often formed and shaped by the context of the situation. And I think likewise what is considered valuable and worthy and useful also depends on certain contextual and relational parameters, or what we can say positions. Now, it's a very loose language that I'm using here, and I recognize that. And I also recognize that within myself, as I sit here in this room, there are plenty of things in here that I value. I look just in front of me. There is I'm not sure what you would call it. Perhaps it looks like a makeup case, but it has one of these interesting little music boxes in which you can wind up the bottom and little notes will play out of this interesting braille-like metal component, and it has metal fingers that sort of are pulled back by the little dots of metal braille, and as they spring down it produces the note, and it's arranged in such a way that this chime will ring out until the spring has unwound. Now, it's an interesting contraption in and of itself, which that experience or that intricacy may have value at some level to other people. But to other people, it will not have the same value to me, because this was my mother's. And this has a particular home in my heart, I would say, that it would not occupy in somebody else's heart. And in that sense, there is this relationship. It is not as though the object is meaningless, but that its worth and its meaning changes relative to our experience and, again, our relationship to it. And so I use that example to try to give this some more concrete binding, so it's not as loose. And I think we can go through any number of analogies. Some things, I think, are more universal than others. Some things are more universally beloved than others. Some things probably are universally less valued than others. And yet, there are no shortage of different experiences and contexts, relationships, positions that force the way that we view something and value something. There are plenty of people out there that will use money on experiences. There are plenty of people that will use money on material goods. There are plenty of people that will use money for X, Y, and Z. That money, of course, is something that we consider to be of value, but it is temporary. It is a placeholder of value. It is a medium of exchange. The exchange has not yet occurred if we have not spent it. And so that value exists as potential. But it will not exist as potential forever because we ultimately spend it on something. All of us value food, but we value it differently perhaps than other objects. We view it as a fundamental. This is one of those universal values. It is something that maintains existence. Now, of things that maintain existence, I think we have an interesting category. Food, again, being one. Shelter, I suppose we can add there. As I speak now, outside it is -3 degrees Fahrenheit. And shelter, I think, is one of those that is fundamental to existence. And right next to me is a space heater. How lucky I am and how thankful I am in this moment to be sheltered and to be warm. If I open my window, I'll be able to see the smoke or the water vapor that is coming out of various stacks in the houses across the landscape. It's quite an interesting thing to examine and to watch in the wintertime. Now, I mention all of this because I think it has to do and it relates to pride, to one's pleasure, satisfaction at their own achievements. And it is not as though one ought not to be satisfied with their achievements. I have another example here. When I had finished college, I finished graduate school, I decided not to go, or not to, rather, I went on the condition that it was a requirement for my graduation, but I did not invite anybody, because I considered it to be something that I was not proud of. And in that sense, it was not a satisfaction in my achievement. And yet, by the same token, I was accused of being proud for not inviting anybody. And I found it a strange catch-22. And in the latter instance, I think, the reason that this was said to me was because I did not consider anything outside of myself. And the pride in this case was the satisfaction in the achievement of my insulation, of my isolation, such that no one was allowed to appreciate the achievement that I had undergone, for the sole reason that I did not view it as an achievement. It almost seems like a paradox. Regardless of whether or not this appears to be a paradox, it serves as an interesting reflection, such that there was an attribution of value to something other than the related elements found palatable, found acceptable, morally acceptable. And from that pushback gave me pause to reflect. Now, I could just as easily not reflected on that experience at all. And that critique of being called a proud person because of my behavior would have gone over my head. But I think that this distinction from the individual in terms of what is valuable, that goes against the other elements, the other nodes in the network, is quite an interesting experience. Because there can be many situations in which this type of thing unfolds. And what I mean by that is the way in which value is accepted or rejected based on its utilization by an individual or a group of individuals. And I think this in turn can affect the way in which we understand somebody to be proud or not. Now, ultimately, this has to scale into something that is actually intelligible. That is something that is not just a flowing, like a breeze, that is just something that is intangible forever. I think that there is a way in which value can be oriented in such a way that man can transcend his current, perhaps even if it's a cultural or societal level value set, to something that is more sophisticated. Now, exactly what that would mean or how that looks, it's difficult to say without all of the complex, intricate details in place that we can examine. And I suppose that we can examine various points in history. To know history at that level of detail, I'm not sure that I do. I suppose that I can come up with a few different examples, but outside of the ones that I've mentioned, I'm not sure exactly. Well, first and foremost, I'm not exactly sure where to go from here. And as a consequence, I'm not exactly sure how that analogy would fit here. But to regroup and to reorganize here for a moment, so that I don't lose the thought or the path, the way. We are considering pride and high look and a proud heart. This is where we are starting, specifically with proud heart. Now, we've discussed so far the danger of the self, the danger of attributing too much value to one's achievements. And we don't want to attribute too much value to something or to one's own achievements, because it will affect a number of things. First, the thing that comes to mind that I had mentioned is our connectedness or bondedness to those other individuals in the network, those other nodes in the network, which means a lot to us, or it ought to mean a lot to us. Close relationships are important. Many of us need love in order to to move through life. It is almost as fundamental as having something to eat or having a roof over our heads. Going off of that, at that level, I think we discussed value at different layers, different levels, but at the level of the principle, at the fundament, upon which, if we imagine a house, the various load-bearing beams, whether they be iron beams or wooden beams, they accept the majority of the weight of the house. Now, there are other wood elements within the house that provide more of a... There is a structural component to them, no doubt, but they provide more of a... It's an infrastructure, it is this architecture, it is a design, it is the layout of the house. In particular, I think of the frame of the house. The frame is not as fundamental in a sense as the load-bearing elements. Now, of course, elements of the frame are load-bearing in terms of walls and things, but not in terms of the horizontal component. There are other components outside of the frame of the house that are wood, that provide more of a cosmetic appearance, and we can think of that as the molding around doors and around windows. We could think of the footboards or the ceiling boards that line our walls that make things look a little bit more sophisticated. We could think about the various types of furniture that are made of wood. Again, these in and of themselves have aesthetic qualities, different attributes that we might find valuable. Some of them might be sentimental, which would be akin to the example that I had used earlier about my mother's little music box. And as we go out from the fundamental layer, the degree of I don't want to say potential, but the degree of possibility for which different nodes in the network may have different opinions about what is actually valuable will be more variable, and it's less variable towards the centerpiece, towards those load-bearing beams, because they're fundamental to the house. And at some level, the house is not this cosmetic agent. It is something that we have so that we can be safe from the elements, first and foremost. And so this sort of scaled value set is dependent upon the more fundamental ones. Now from here, I think we can go in many different directions. We can go in terms of the material value, and we can go in terms of the heavenly value or the conscious value, both of which are important. There have been many situations in man's history for which there have been men that have sacrificed themselves for a greater good that has nothing, that's not necessarily tied to anything material. I mean, we could be considering something that's geographic, but even among the geography, it's more of a ideal. If what I'm thinking of here, for example, during the Peloponnesian War, when Athens is at war with the Lacedaemonians or Sparta, and they are in this short period of truce, they decide to go and invade Sicily. And there are a number of reasons why they want to do that. Partially, it is for glory and honor. And yet they are overextending themselves. They're at war with the Spartans. At any time, the Spartans can realize their efforts so far away from home and just go up north and invade their territory, burn their crops, kill their people, and so forth. And they do it not so much for the geography, they do it for the maintenance of their empire, which is more than just their geography. Now, the geography is fundamental to it, but it is not all that it is. The empire transcends that geographical component. Now, I think just as we can imagine the house being this representation of value, analogy to value, we can turn to the mind and consider what exactly is valuable to the mind in the way that the joists of the house are the fundamental load-bearing components to it, such that the house is a fundamental component to maintain our existence, to keep us sheltered from the elements and from danger. What are the fundamentals of mind that keep us sheltered from insanity or from darkness or from the pit of Sheol, perhaps, as the psalmists write, for which there is an architecture that can be built on top of it, such that we can have lofty ideals, strong values, strong morals. And I think that it's a difficult matter, to imagine the load-bearing value component. Now, the Ten Commandments are certainly up there. Certain fundamentals of behavior that are written within those commandments that have been learned throughout the ages. Now, in the case of the house, if the house becomes prideful, I would say those that are within it fail to recognize the fundamental value set that everything is built on top of. And what begins to happen is that downstream, as things are built on top of it, those that occupy that space, that utilize that tool, forget what the fundamental purpose of it is. And it is the mismatching of the purposefulness to the reality of what it is meant to do, that there is this mismatch. And the mismatch, we have to wonder what exactly it causes. Surely it causes all sorts of mayhem, dissatisfaction, blindness, I suppose, getting lost within the ego, getting lost within the self, getting lost within the material garnish, the material ornaments of the home, such that the fundamental purpose of the home in general is forgotten. And there's more to the fundamentals of the home. It's not just the safety and security, it's the propagation of experience and of family. And so I think in that way we have this prideful component as it enters into the sphere and the gradations of value as they exist within the mind of man. Without proper reverence towards the fundamental principles, we are surely going to find ourselves wound within, unable to appreciate, unable to perceive the purpose of anything. And so now the question becomes, if one is unable to see the purpose of anything, how can we relate this to the heart? In what way do we consider a proud heart? So thus far I've been referring to the heart in a multifaceted way. I've been conceptualizing the heart as an aspect of mind, but it is a peculiar aspect of mind. Much like the soul is a peculiar aspect of man, or his spirit is a peculiar aspect, the heart is something that is quite fundamental. It is something that can be influenced by his reason, but also has an agency of its own, it would seem. Now the heart I have considered thus far as to be the seat of our feelings and our desires. It is something that, on one hand, is quite elementary. It is It serves as a base layer, a base foundation for human experience. The human heart is peculiar to the human being, as far as we know. The human heart has this fascinating capacity, almost like a river that flows. There are no shortage of interesting species of fish that flow in that river. There are no shortage, perhaps, of interesting tributaries that river may take. There are many, likewise I can say that there are many feelings that we can feel. There are many feelings that we can attach to memories. There are many feelings that we can attach to particular instances. Particular interactions can invoke certain feelings. Certain cultural expectations can facilitate certain desires. Within all of this relatedness and interaction, there is potential. There's potential for great good and great evil. There's potential for great harmony and great disharmony. There's potential for the appropriate matching for one's feelings towards an appropriate behavior or interaction, and there is an inappropriate match for one's feelings and behavior. And I know that we have all had the experience of being overly emotional in a particular situation, and that emotion tends to cloud us. Typically, we would say that it clouds our reason. An interesting expression, to cloud our reason. For within that analogy, we have a few different images. The cloud is something that obscures. What does it obscure? It obscures vision. It obscures such a fundamental conception of perception. That fundamental perception, or the conception of that perception, in our minds is used as something much broader. It's not only just in terms of visualization physically, but it is imaginative, it's expansive, it is understanding, it's conceptual. Within the beauty and the expansiveness of mind, we also see this expanse of vision. Just as I can look out my window now, I live on the 4th floor of a building, and I can see out quite some distance. I can move my figurative eyes into the conceptual sphere and look out and peer out over all of the interactions, the experiences, the learned material that I have in my mind, and reflect, just as I reflect and peer out through my window. And when I say that our emotions, our feelings, and our desires there is this possibility for clouding or obscuring our vision. It is this conceptual sphere. I suppose it can find its way all the way down to the physical level as well. As it distracts our attention, we only direct our gaze towards what we wish to pay attention to. And if there are strong feelings, strong desires, our attention and our physical vision could be quite tunnel visioned as well. Interesting, I think, sequence of relationships there. Now, on the other hand, as feelings are appropriately matched to situations, we are afforded something. We are afforded a particular type of highway, a particular infrastructure upon which we can travel. We are unobstructed, and we travel towards something, towards some end, towards some bondedness, some experience that we can have and we can hold that is useful not only to us but to perhaps the person in the situation that we are interacting with. Feelings can serve as facilitators for conversation, for interaction, for exchange, of the expression of thoughts that are valuable or create valuable experiences. In short, the heart is fundamental to the human experience, both the good that comes with it and the bad. In addition to all of this, I have brought into the analogy the little adjuster. This little adjuster I imagine as this mechanistic being that exists within the mind. Of course, it's a figurative, imaginative being, example. But this little being is, like I said, an adjuster. It's almost like a dam on that river. It controls which feelings are filtered through. It can restrain, it can temper when necessary, and it can release when needed. And I think about that release, about when in those instances when perhaps something happens in life, it builds up to a certain point. Our emotions, our feelings, our experiences, they build up to this point. Perhaps it's either joy or sorrow, for which the elation or the melancholy pulls us towards this strong release. The dam has opened its valves, and what rages forth is the sort of hemorrhage of emotion. Now I say that because I'm reflecting on this little adjuster and of the different experiences that we can have relative to what we allow ourselves. Some of this is dictated by our reason, certainly. Some of it is dictated by some, not necessarily conscious, perhaps it's conscious at a certain level, but awareness. Awareness of others, awareness of our behavior relative to others. So there are certain circumstances where showing particular emotions are just not necessary, not appropriate. There are other circumstances, situations, when we are within a certain company that showing, expressing emotions are entirely appropriate. And lastly, to the matter of the will of the heart, I've conceptualized this as sort of a primordial will. It is something that is difficult to explain. It exists beneath our conscious experience most of the time, although it reaches the level of our awareness, no doubt. But in terms of explicit understanding and reason, often it is stimulated before that mechanism has a chance to catch up to it. And in this sort of situation, I think of the intense feelings and perhaps the anxiety or the fear or the excitement that may come from a dangerous situation. It could be, I think of the savannah in which we are confronted by a predator, a lion, whatever. Or if we are at home and someone breaks into our house and the sudden rush of emotions. Oftentimes this sort of thing is, like I said, beneath our awareness until the reason catches up and starts to examine what the heart is trying to tell it. And once it does that, it goes through that sequence of trying to determine if we are in danger, or perhaps it doesn't have to be all entirely negative. It can certainly be, I think of like a surprise birthday party. That certainly would invoke strong emotions, hopefully positive emotions. And so this is the general picture of the heart that I have conceptualized so far within this book, the book of Proverbs. And surely there is more to be said about the heart and about the nature of our experience, but since we are focusing on this verse, and high look, and a proud heart, and the plowing of the wicked is sin, we are focusing, we are attending to this proud heart. Now the heart has an intimate relationship with our reason. our logic, our deductive, inductive part of ourselves that is quite strong in terms of its self-awareness. And I think our reason is, I suppose our heart is too, subject to this potential, what would we say, subject to potential contamination by pride, some understanding of excessive self-worth. Certainly one can find themselves there by reason, by examining their accomplishments, and giving themselves an overinflated sense of self-worth. The heart can come along on that experience as they think about these things, imagine these things. They can excite themselves. Certainly I've had this experience with myself after I've achieved something. I try to do it less and less, but I am still vulnerable to self-praise. A proud heart. In sum, I think we can say, since the prideful component, in that negative sense, it tips the scale for one to be unable to perceive what is purposeful, what is meaningful, and that is because their relationship to value is skewed. And it's difficult here because when we say it's skewed, well, it has to be skewed relative to something. If it is off an axis, well, what is the axis around which it ought to revolve? Now, it's not sufficient to say God or to say Lord. Now, it is a good placeholder. And I think as we grow in our faith, the understanding of this term becomes more and more sophisticated. But at every moment, when we say Lord, when we say God, it should be an invoking factor. That little adjuster should have a specific gate, causeway, by which he opens a particular emotion. This particular emotion is in tandem with our reason, so the emotion is provocative. It provokes a memory. Now the key is the word. The key is God and Lord. The key can unlock that little, or signal to the adjuster to open that valve, to release that memory, to release the feelings that then unlock that memory for which the reason can examine. Now that examination of that term is, and ought to be, quite lofty, because the axis around which we place value is no small matter. It is quite important. It is fundamental. It is as fundamental as man's physical existence in the world. Now, as I've said before, self-awareness is not necessarily a bad thing. But if the self occupies more and more of the awareness of what? The awareness of that we have the capacity to exert in the world, then of course the eye of the mind, the eye of the self, will turn in on itself, and it will be locked within that cage of the self, which we would call selfishness. As we reduce that attention towards other things, and again, revert that towards the self, the question becomes, well, what exactly are the other things? What else is there to pay attention to other than the self? Well, of course, there are plenty of things that are outside of the self that we attend to. Some things we attend on behalf of the self. Or I should say, we attend to things outside of the self on behalf of the self to maintain its survival, for example, like the procurement of food or the exertion of labor such that we can afford a house, again, food. And I think that there is a level of sophistication here that I have yet to touch on. And that is to say, ultimately, regardless of if the self captures awareness, or if it extends its attention away from itself onto external information, which could be the relatedness to others, it could be custom, culture, it can mean many different things outside of itself. Ultimately, that information is going to come back to the self. And the question then becomes, well, is existence not just an entirely selfish experience? And I think the answer is no, because I think that there is two types, perhaps there are more than two types, but what appears to me at the moment is that there are two fundamental types of attention. And if it is the case that the self, as it exerts its attention, regardless of whether it is turned in or turned out, that there is some inevitable return of information back to the self and this self-reflection, then I wish to make the distinction between the self that pays attention only to itself and the self that pays attention to something outside of it. Now, I think of the self that pays attention, that pays awareness to something outside of itself, and I would like to stop here for a moment and reflect on pay. To pay something, we are using an analogy of money. Money as a medium of exchange. If we are to sort of draw an equivalent here, we can say attention is a medium of exchange. Sometimes it's hard to capture that value. It's like trying to capture the electrons as they flow through a wire, as it lights up the light bulb. We're seeing the light bulb, we're seeing the experience, but it's almost like we're trying to catch not necessarily the essence, but we're trying to catch the unseen, almost. Of the self that is paying attention to something outside of it, that external information. Now, I spent a lot of time last episode going through essentially this sort of argument about the relationship of the self to reality, and I'm glad that I'm being prompted to do so again, so forgive me. But of the self that pays attention to external information, and I'm not too keen on the subject-object paradigm, but for now it's going to be useful. I think there are different ways in which the self can interact with that external information. If inevitably that information comes back on itself, it can examine that information only so far as to promote selfish desire. This would be the prideful heart, selfish desire. To inflate the ego, to inflate that part of the mind, that part of the self that is entirely concerned with how it appears. It is this auto-actualization, it is the divinity of the self the divinity of the self within, the attention turns within, the value, the axis around which the person is constituted and oriented is fundamentally that self and that mind that perceives existence. And there is another type, I think, that utilizes information to connect the self to a broader picture. And it's not to deny the self, but it is to connect the self. And it then becomes not necessarily the self and the outside, or I should say more fundamentally, the self and the appearance of the outside. Because if the divination is within the self, then the self is the true thing, the true existence. It is the thing that is. The only true, reliable thing about his experience is the self. It rather becomes the self in relation to that which is, which, saying it that way, really isn't all that satisfying. What does it mean to be in relationship to that which is? Well, if we sort of examine by exclusion, if we examine how, if the self is all that is, then the appearance of the world is just an illusion. It is sort of a game that is being run on the divinity of mind, with all of the bizarre failures of the self. And everything outside of it, every person, is just a sort of illusion, delusion. But if it's outside, but if the divinity and the axis of value is on the outside, or I should say, if it is not placed within the substrate, the mind of man, but within what we might call the plane, the environment, not just of mind, but also physical experience, the connection of those two, the heaven and earth, the union of those two. A common expression that has been used these days is the agent-arena relationship, where the arena is sort of that environment, the agent is the self. That relational aspect is the self-restraining aspect. It is that transjective that crosses that bridges the gap to the environment, to the arena, such as the agent is a player in the arena, and it is not that the agent is playing a game within the agent, it is an agent playing within the arena. The arena also includes the agent. Ultimately, there is this line into the intelligible reality. At least the conception here from the Old Testament is that there is a source of that intelligibility that permeates this, allows all of this to be, and that is the fundamental existence, that is the true axis of value. The human being has plenty of different ways by which he can connect to it. He can examine life through cultural complexities, through economics, through socio-cultural patterns, through history, through experience, through the connectedness and bondedness of familial relationships, through his labors and his experience, through his occupation. There are plenty of things that he can attend to that will allow him to understand better his place and his connectedness to the arena. And there's a lot of complexity. Now again, the proud heart. This heart is the one that directs all those feelings, that attention inward. It is not restrained, as it should be, by that transjective, by its place in the arena, which is truly something that exists independent, or in tandem with, or in congruence with, in conglomeration with. They occupy the same reality. They are of the same substrate. Now, it's interesting that I went to the second part here, That is to say, the verse begins with an high look and a proud heart. And high look is an interesting thing, I think, to start with. I think it's important to start with the high look first. But I'm glad that we went through proud heart first, because it softens our landing, I think. Because if we imagine a high look, that's where we will be. Now, it would be kind of, maybe if I examined that first, it would have sort of been an interesting experience to go down that slide and then slide into the proud heart. It might have been kind of painful to do it, but since we have that basin for which we are considering the high look, and high look, I think, is going to lead into this pride. But let's try to unpack what this means. High look. Now, when I see the word high, I think of a physical representation, something that is above something else, but it's not just something that is above something else. Because we can say that something is above something else, but it doesn't quite get at what the word high means. Now, high, I think there's a connotation in which it is expressing both aboveness, but also excess aboveness. I could say that a person is taller than me, but I don't necessarily say that they are high, or they are high up. If I was on the first story of a building, perhaps I was outside, and there's a person on the fourth floor standing on the balcony, I would say that they're high up. And so it's by magnitude, as it is by the maybe more fundamental condition of being above. So now, what does this look mean? Now, I think I've discussed it a little bit when I went into the analogy of perception, using the eyes as that organ, that vehicle through which we see into the physical sphere. We take in all of that information. And then I said something about the eye of the mind, the eye of that conceptual sphere, that heaven and earth type motif. But it's not just the eye. It is not just conception. It is not, perhaps we can say, if something is seen, we can also sort of draw an inference that something is also understood. Here we are using a different word, the word look. It seems as though we are talking about the action, the doing in this visual sphere. If I am to look at something, I am to orient my attention towards something. The word look is not often used to express the question, did you see that? I suppose we can say, did you look at that? But that, at least in the modern context, now this may be an inappropriate interpretation based on that context, but when we say, did you look at that, it almost seems to imply, did you do what was asked of you? Usually people say, did you see that, if an event had occurred? And one is wishing to see or to confirm of the other if something actually was witnessed in the way that that person had witnessed it. Or another interesting expression, look and see if. Now, when one says look and see if this is in the cabinet, for example, the look and the see are used in different they're meant to be used such that they mean different things. The looking is the act, and the seeing is the sort of result. It is the comprehension. And so, moving forward with this verse, I think my understanding of look here is the orientation of attention. Now, to put this together, we have an orientation of attention to excess aboveness. Now this word excess, it has this connotation of beyond or more than appropriate. Now turning one's attention to something that is more than appropriate is an interesting sort of thing, because within the mind of man there seems to be all the available land in the world to propagate our intelligible sphere. But I think what this verse is implying is that there is a limit to that intelligible sphere given the restraints of man. And the restraints of man involve his biology. It involves, by extension, the time that he lives, that he is allowed to be in existence, allowed to be just full stop. Now the idea of the restraints of man, I believe I had gone over that in a little bit more detail in the last episode. And I'm not sure if it's entirely necessary to go through all of that again, at least at this point. But the main reflection here, I think, is we see a theme, especially when we consider the words that follow this, and a proud heart. There is this connotation, this lack of humility, that is the danger, the warning that is permeating through this verse. Again, the proud heart, this profoundly experiential aspect of man, for which his ability to understand what is appropriate or what is good is supplanted by his own inner being, by his own, perhaps not own inner being, but it is supplanted by his own selfish desire. And that selfish desire is, again, the worship of that inner being. And so we have a visualization of an overextension in the form of this high look and a form of blindness, this excess pride, lack of humility in the proud heart. And the plowing of the wicked is sin. Now, this is an interesting part of the verse, the plowing of the wicked. I think that this part here is fundamental to understand. For what does it mean to plow the wicked? Does it mean to roll them over such that they are destroyed? Does it mean to plow such that an ox carries a plow to turn up the earth in preparation to sow some seed? I suppose it's difficult to say. The word wicked is used often in the book of Proverbs. The wicked thus far I have spoken of extensively. I have conceptualized it as a form of self-centeredness, a form of self-deception, a form of relatedness to the world that is limited, again, by their own selfish desire. That of the fool and that of those that are evil, I think, express some shared territory with the wicked in that perversion of self and that abnormality of self-relations. Now, in the sense of plowing, as in the sense of mowing down or destroying, one might say that there is a positive element in the destruction of the wicked. In verse 20, or rather in chapter 20, verse 26, a wise king scatters the wicked and brings the wheel over them. That type of imagery is fairly intense. It is the destruction of the wicked, It is the dispersion of their tendencies, the dissolving of their place in society, or moving them to a different place, perhaps. If wickedness is always to exist in the experience of man, bringing the wheel over them, I think, it's a commentary on the immediacy of the removal of that plague from a society, and then the dispersion is to move them towards the fringes where they must necessarily exist if they are not to sink the ship. And if we were to say that the plowing of the wicked is a sin, it wouldn't quite add up. Now, there are two ways that we can go here. Perhaps more than that, but two that appear to me at this moment. One is that the plowing of the wicked has to do with more of that agricultural example, in which, as the plow goes over the wicked, it is turning up that substrate, that wicked substrate, by which a seed can be planted in the earth. Now, from that, we can interpret that the plowing of the wicked and the substrate underneath is bad. It is not a good soil in order to grow a seed that is planted within it. To plant a seed within the soil of wickedness is only to produce more wickedness. On the other hand, we can consider this image as a destruction of the surface layer. That surface layer is that cancer, that wickedness on the surface. As it is destroyed, beneath there is that fertile under substructure, for which then a seed could be planted and it can grow. The third way, I think, of approaching this has to do with a combination in which we are considering the totality of this verse. We're considering what was said about the overextension of attention, looking beyond the capabilities of the human being to see, or at least attempting to do so, and then the falling into this selfish delusion that is propagated by the experiential component of man's existence, which involve heavily his feelings and his, the feeling of connectedness to his being. And then that flows into the plowing of the wicked. Now, under the condition or the context of that overextension and that selfish deception, if the wicked are to be plowed in that case, certainly it would just be wicked plowing wicked. Because a man of such qualities, having a proud heart and a high look, I think is a recipe for wickedness. If not now, then perhaps sometime in the future. Now, I think there's further yet that we can still go. I think we can think of this as at least the expression plowing of the wicked. We can think of this as the wicked are doing the plowing, that they are the ones that are sowing their fields with wickedness. Now, I think that interpretation, and also the plowing of the wicked, as in a man, regardless of his state morally, using the plow to plow within the substrate of wickedness, I think both of those can work quite well here. And I understand that there are different interpretations, or rather different interpretations or translations of this verse, some of which I think are a bit easier to understand than the King James Version, which I'm reading. But nonetheless, all three of these things go together. High look, proud heart, plowing of the wicked. We have this extension of misplaced attention and experience. And that misplaced attention and experience is growing within the earth. Now it's interesting that we can even consider misplaced attention and experience as something that would even be something that would grow, but I think we have to recognize the variability of the intelligible sphere and the capacity for, what can we say, evil, the capacity for the opposite of intelligibility, the capacity for the opposite of intelligibility by those who are beings that can actually intuit and recognize the intelligible world, as bizarre as that seems and it sounds. But certainly, I think it is not beyond us to see how in a family, for example, and let's say it's a dysfunctional family, and perhaps there's drug addiction that is occurring within the home, or there is just people within the home that have had children that were not ready to have children, or they were not the type of people that should have had children given the current place in life that they were in. And the dysfunction and the what I consider to be this moldy type of growth that one might see if something is left too long in a refrigerator. That it is something that, for the mold, it does as it does to propagate and reproduce. But to us, it is damaging. It is not something that we want in our refrigerator. It is not something that we want to consume. It will make us ill. And in this way, this family is propagating this mold and this illness. This illness within the family, creating those from the seed of the child up into adulthood, and they take that with them. They take their poor upbringing with them. Sometimes it is used as a springboard into something greater, into a greater purpose in life, but I think often there is this sort of downward spiral that accompanies that painful upbringing. And in this way, I think it's easier to appreciate how this sort of thing can exist within the intelligible substrate, because it's not just the good that can exist. It is also that which is misplaced, the misplaced good, under the belief that one is doing good, or under the self-delusion, the proud heart, or the high look. The thoughts of the diligent tend only to plenteousness, but of every one that is hasty, only to want. Now, sometimes I annoy even myself, as I have a tendency to say that even though a verse may seem straightforward, it's always important. It is of the diligent person, perhaps, staying consistent with the verse, to dive a little bit deeper than one would otherwise. For if we stay at the surface, we cannot really come to appreciate. We cannot come to be with. We cannot be connected to the true meaning, the true value. In some sense, time is required, I think, for us to become connected to something, just like time is required in a relationship. But it is not just time, because of course if two people were just sitting in the same room and no experiences were had, no words were exchanged all the time in the world, I don't think would connect people in the way that shared experiences and conversation and this sort of thing do. So time is a component, but it does not the only thing that we need to attend to here. We need to pay time, attention, and we need to dive deeper into the otherwise readily apparent themes of the verses. Because surely it makes sense to me, the first half of this verse. The thoughts of the diligent tend only to plenteousness. But when I ask myself how, it's a little bit more difficult. For one needs to understand what the word diligent means in order to understand how this can lead to plenteousness, or having a full supply of something, an abundance of something. So let's take diligence, the word. Now, from ancient Rome, there was the Latin verb diligo, which meant to love, to esteem highly, or to choose. Now the prefix di or di signified intensity, separation, or thoroughness. It adds a sense of focus and attention to the act of loving. Then lego, sort of what the suffix of that word diligo is born of. It meant to gather, to choose, to read, signifying a deliberation of selection and care involved in loving something. In Middle English, it transformed to be something that was included the core meaning of loving something, but added and now implied dedication, carefulness, meticulousness, or persistence in one's endeavors. In modern English, we have a continual refinement. It became associated with conscientiousness, industry, an unwavering effort in pursuing a goal. Love, as the core of the original meaning, became subtler, suggesting that one's dedication to something stemmed from a deeper appreciation or valuing of the task at hand. Now here I would like to pause and reflect a little bit. There's a parallel I think I can draw with my own life. A few different experiences that I've had. And these experiences are not necessarily singular in nature. They're not immediate experiences. They are more of the type of experiences that one has after a period of time has allowed those experiences to settle and the dust has cleared and one is able to further appreciate the result. And when I say result, I mean after everything is said and done, one can look back almost like a storm that has gone through a certain place. We know that it had gone through because of the downed power lines or the trees that had been pushed over. We can, in some sense, assess the damage, or we can assess the work of art that was produced. But much like the chain, the etymological chain that we have just discussed here, life and life's experiences, I think, can unfold in this way. And the strange pattern that I seem to see when I analyze this word, diligence, from its roots, I see a word that has come to be from something, and a word that has come to be from something that was more fundamental. Now, when I say fundamental, in some sense we can think of this as elementary, but also we can think of it as load-bearing. This original Latin word, something like the attention, the thoroughness towards loving something, to choose, to gather, to read. This volitional action paired with a type of being and a state of bondedness. It's difficult to get more fundamental than that. And then on top of that we pile on not necessarily the more superficial, but the details, the meticulous, the carefulness, the dedication, subtlety. Further, we refine the virtue, unwavering, industriousness, conscientiousness, or the willingness to do what is right, especially to do one's work or duty well and thoroughly, as the Google definition says. Now, the pattern here that I was reflecting on was a potential danger. Of course, my mind is always this. It has this pessimistic bent to it, unfortunately. However, it is useful in hindsight. And I think that my mind initially went towards, well, what if we lose the continuity between the root or the origin, and then we are left with what is on top, what is built on top of it. We lose the foundation, in other words. What are we to do with the meaning of the word? Does it then just become some hollowed out thing? The virtues that are on top of it certainly have value in and of themselves, but without the deeper core, what do we really understand of them? Likewise, in my life, the experiences that I've had that have unfolded over a period, sometimes it's difficult to justify our experiences, to understand why we had done something. And because of this misunderstanding of doing and of being, we come to the point of confusion, disconnectedness. We understand at some level why something is important, but we can no longer enact it or perhaps be connected to it in such a way that it is not just something that conceptually is agreeable to us, but it is agreeable to us experientially. And this type of disconnect, I think, can lead to profound rift and psychological strain. But to put that aside for the moment, as that's not necessarily needed for this verse, the thoughts of the diligent tend only to plenteousness. What can we say of the thoughts of the diligent? Well, the thoughts of the diligent, a diligent person, I think by necessity must be somebody that is aroused. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, I mean that despite their physical capacity, despite the biological limitations which vary among individuals, despite the quickness of his mind, his will, I think, can do quite a lot. I think of the story of the tortoise and the hare. The hare was much faster than the tortoise, and yet the hare was lazy. And the tortoise, by virtue of his own diligence, won the race, while the rabbit fell asleep under a tree. This arousal is a state of mind that is active. We can say that it is turned on. Now there are plenty of situations in our lives in which we would rather our minds be dulled. Not necessarily turned off, but also not necessarily strained. I think necessarily many of us wish that the gas could be let off, that we are not always revving that engine, because it's tiring, it's difficult, it's stressful. At times, it can seem purposeless and meaningless. And for those who are diligent, or perhaps were diligent, and found themselves in a place of crisis, it's very difficult to rediscover that arousal, that thirst for life, that intensity, that thoroughness. To choose to be an unwavering individual, to choose to love something deeply and have faith in that thing. It's almost as if, at times, man's mind is akin to a circuit. Circuits are able to be blown. They can short. And when this happens, of course, the circuit needs to be reconstituted, needs to be reset. I think of a breaker in the house. When a circuit is blown, we reset the breaker such that the circuit can be reconstituted and our appliances can return to normal functioning. But that state of offness in which the electricity is not flowing is such a painful state to be, because at some level there is a mind, a will within there. Perhaps the embers of a once diligent heart still remain, and those thoughts spin. And one would hope, one would wish, one would desire that those thoughts build, they snowball into something larger, to more sophisticated, more purposeful. And that breaker is reset so that it can pick up from where it left off. And therein lies another question. If this is to happen, or just in general in terms of a boy coming to be a man, or a man coming into being, into a greater sense of himself, a greater sense of his relatedness to the world, how does one discover the diligo, or diligo, whatever? How does one discover that diligence? How does one discover that intense passion or love for something? Surely all of those that are successful in life have some intense passion for something, and it is something that they've found early in life, and they've devoted many hours to it. But perhaps the word, or the question, how, is a selfish question. Perhaps I ought not to start there. I think the better question to start with is where. Where is it? If it could be found, then surely there is a location for this thing, for this intensity. But what is intensity without that connectedness? There aren't many people, I would say, that are just sort of intense because they are intense. They are intense because of something, because they are grounded by something. And certainly I'll have to admit that a man can be intensely in love about many things, some of which may be wicked, some of which may be good. And perhaps part of my wandering earlier has to do with this death and rebirth of finding a new love for which the old love was inefficient or insufficient in some way. Or there may be fundamental elements that were load-bearing that had broken in the process of the downward spiral. There is a process of reconstituting those broken elements, but also the discovery of new elements. And the discovery of new elements is fascinating to me. The discovery or rediscovery of love. Love and loves, I should say. And that slow, meticulous build upon that. Just like one that has gotten out of shape gets back into shape. If one ever has had that experience, it's quite strange to be in very good shape and then to get out of shape physically. At once they understood their body quite well. The body went with them when they required it. But after a period of inactivity that can last for years, when I say activity, I mean just sort of the regular, even if they are working full-time, that is still a level of inactivity, even if they're on their feet all day. Physical fitness is not a simple matter. It requires a lot of sacrifice, a lot of attention. And if that attention is not oriented to something, some broader good, it can fall short. The experience itself is not enough to maintain the attention, to maintain the intensity. There's no throughness in the experience that guides one through this sort of portal between that self and the world that is, between the self, perhaps, and some good beyond the self. Maybe that's a better way of putting it. And surely it could be the case that one may spend their entire lives waiting for the mind to stumble upon that good for which they can fall in love with. And that waiting prevents them from living their lives and experiencing. Growing more and more insular and more frustrated that what they hoped for and what they know to be out there has not found them. But surely we have to understand that this is a dynamic relationship. That this type of thinking is an introduction into wickedness, into selfishness, under the guise of self-pity, self-doubt perhaps, lack of humility, in the sense of one believing that this good that they know to exist will be there for them without their effort. And I have had experiences in my life where this has been true. I've also had experiences in which I have found deep loves, and I've followed them, and I follow them to this day. And as I reflect on the mistakes of my past, these sorts of things seem to shine through as lessons learned. So this marks a new day, a break in the continuity of recording. And so I'm going to be starting from a new thought here, and it might seem abrupt, which is why I mentioned that this is a new day. Now, perhaps I should start with a reflection to get the ball rolling, as it were. One state of mind, and perhaps state of being, is an interesting thing. It's a beautiful thing to be of a reflective sort that can examine one's own being, that can examine one's own experience. And I had an exchange with a friend the other day. And this exchange, I had within my mind a particular aim, not necessarily goal, but general direction for which I was aiming. I suppose you could say if there was a goal, it was a goal of getting down to the root of being, the root of his being, as he was showing me a hobby of his that he enjoyed. And through the understanding of one's hobbies, I think one can truly understand or get to know somebody better. And surely this is a hobby of mine, to go through the Bible, the Scripture, to read certain things, to reflect on them in this capacity. Now, this friend of mine, his hobby was, I guess you can call it, it's a form of agriculture. Maybe horticulture is the right word for it. I'll spare too many details, but it is a genuine hobby of his. He produces, or he grows, many tropical plants. Since I'm in the Midwest of the United States, it's interesting to have such a large environment in which all of these plants are growing. And I was invited to take care of these plants while he is away overseas. And he introduced me to the process by which he goes through the plants and waters them, and all the intricate details that he has learned over the process of engaging in that hobby. And through that experience, we spent some time together, and I had asked him various questions. And the questions that I asked him are related to this aim or to this goal. And that was to get to the root of why and to the root of his being, essentially. Trying to find the reason for why we do things. Where the interest is, where the passion is born. Because it seems to me where the passion is born is where the good stuff is. Is where that true bonding, I think, can occur. Once we touch on that nerve, we can ride that highway. We can really explore one's thoughts and interests. We can expand on them. We can meditate on them, reflect on them. And the process by which one is guided to that place is a delicate one. And I think it requires trust and a strong relationship to do so. And we went a little way into that territory, perhaps not as much as I would have liked, but certainly enough to understand a little bit more about the hobby and a little bit more about how we are different and how we are related in regards to that. Because I myself do not necessarily find planting and growing to be a passion of mine to the degree that it is of his. And yet after he shared and I asked some questions, I had found his appreciation for it. And I had come to the understanding that if I kept on asking him these sorts of questions, and he kept on answering them in a particular way, that I was being called towards that passion for which he is being called. And sometimes it's interesting that the questions surrounding my own passions, which is this, a passion through which I try and discover the ultimate passion, the ultimate relationship to God. And of course, within the experiential realm, within this horticulture hobby, there is the experience of God in there. That is that passion that is born. And again, finding the road to that passion is a wonderful and beautiful journey. And when I read this verse, the thoughts of the diligent tend only to plenteousness. Plenteousness is such a large word. It can be quite small given our superficial cultural distinctions and value of material goods. But when I consider my time that I had spent yesterday discussing this passion of my friends, I recognize that there is a diligence not only within the art of what he was doing, but also in terms of the conversation that we were having, the attentiveness that was required of me to ask him the questions to get us both to the place of his passion, such that we can be connected in a greater sense. And once we are in a place, once we have found ourselves pushing the threshold for which he understood why he was doing what he was doing, the true beautiful thing and the true thing that really had enthralled me was pushing that further. Was asking the question of, okay, so we're here at this point. What is after this? What about this passion can we grow? What about the root do we have yet to discover? And of course, if I had approached this situation in haste, and I tried to find some cheap, euphoric satisfaction out of what he was doing in terms of his hobby, it wouldn't have been there. That art of horticulture is quite slow. It requires patience. It requires a lot of experience. It requires a lot of time. And if I had chased this euphoric understanding or participation in that experience for which he was showing me the process of taking care of these plants, I would not have found it if I didn't believe that this was something that was to be grown and cultivated, much like the plants are grown and cultivated. The thoughts of the diligent tend only to plenteousness, but of every one that is hasty only to want. A strong parallel, I think, to the experience that I had just mentioned. Perhaps one more comment before I close on this verse. And I think that this comment has to do with the word want. Want, I think, is a term that is that has an inherent negative pressure. And what I mean by that is an analogy. So when I say negative pressure, I think of a hospital room that has negative pressure, that draws air into it, rather than allows air to flow from it. In the case of a contagious disease or something, an airborne disease, you want a negative pressure in the room so that the virus or whatever it is does not travel through the air out of the room by some positive pressure. That is, the force of the air molecules is always inward and never outward. In a like manner, I think this word want has this negative pressure type effect. And that what it is pulling in, the direction of its pulling is in towards the self. It is in towards the desire. That wanting is, we can say in another sense, it is a longing for something, a desire for something. It is the heart's bread and butter. And surely through haste, through the quickness of doing, whether it be in one's physical action or in one's thoughts, there is much that can be missed. There is little to be seen, little to be experienced. And the journey that is whatever it may be, that we exercise this haste, this quickness of attention or of doing, this lack of care and decisiveness, we find ourselves quickly at an endpoint where we had just begun moments earlier. And so let's take one example. Let's take a thought. There are many thoughts that occur in my mind throughout the day. I am somebody, I think, that has many thoughts, and they dissipate quite quickly. And I don't spend as much time as I ought to on each particular thought. Now, without going into the dangers of over-rumination or excessive self-reflection, I think that there is a certain virtue in the extension of thought towards a particular goal or a particular behavior. And when it is right, when we are called to a certain responsibility, the responsibility is the load that we bear. It is the load that we accept to move through life. It is something that gives us purpose. Of course, there are plenty of loads that are in need of modification, in need of lessening, in need of temperance. But of the responsibilities that we bear, regardless of how we see them, if they are our responsibilities, we are responsible for them. That we are necessarily tied to them. And it is our being that is shown through that responsibility, that is necessarily tied to the world in some way. Now, to do such a thing in haste, to handle a responsibility in haste, is an insult to ourselves and also to the responsibility and those who may be affected by it. Now, I may say such a thing, but that doesn't explain why it is. It is not all that useful of a reflection. To the best of my creative insights at the moment, when I think of something that is done in haste, I think of the potential for missing something. Again, the story of the tortoise and the hare comes up here. But the question arises, well, what exactly are we missing? And by missing, I mean a failure to achieve something, a failure to remember something, a failure to notice something, a failure to understand something. And to be aware of this missing something in hindsight It is to notice the loss or absence of. Now, there are many, I think, examples that we can provide. Many of them are quite simplistic. Some of them can be quite lofty. But outside of the specific examples, there is a principle of unification that I wish to follow here, because I'm quite interested in this missing and the recognition of absence. For what can be said of absence? Well, of the whole of absence, if something is absence, that means it's just not there. Now, of something, some goal, or some responsibility, as I've mentioned, there are things that are asked of us in order to accomplish something, in order for the goal to be realized. There are, in many cases, sequence of steps that must be met in order for the goal to come about. And the better, the more thorough these steps are brought forward, the more vibrant and noticeable that endpoint and goal is. And I think for us, for myself, the experience of putting together the pieces that build up that goal are just as valuable as the goal itself. And sometimes I think it's difficult to justify, especially given the modern way of life, that everything is so quick, that everything must be convenient and safe. It's almost hard to imagine a world that would do things for the sake of things that are to be done. That's not to say that they don't exist in our culture. Certainly they do. But oftentimes I wonder about our culture of expedience and of safety and of convenience. If we do not lose something by living this way, that we lose something fundamental that leads us to this wanting, to that negative pressure, within which we are always drawn to the heart that is nagging us, asking us, why? Why do you make me impoverished? I need more out of life than what you have given me. The getting of treasures by a lying tongue is a vanity tossed to and fro of them that seek death. So here we go again. Buckle that seatbelt. And let's try to find some meaning. Let's start with the lying tongue. For a lie, I think, is no simple matter, both in terms of what it means and also its implications. The meaning, however, I think is what is most interesting to me. The meaning of a lie. Something that is contrary to the truth. And many times throughout the Proverbs we are prompted to think about what the truth is. And it has been difficult to come to some definite understanding of what the truth is, given how limited I am in my understanding of various elements of the world and my limited experience and all of this sort of thing. However, despite all of my failures, I do not believe that truth is relative in an absolute sense, nor do I believe that there is no truth outside of the self. So perhaps I should start with the question, is a lie always a bad thing? Or can it be good in certain contexts or situations? Part of what makes a lie a bad thing is the potential for deception. But why is it deceiving? Why is a lie deceiving? Well, it brings us away from something. It brings us away from the truth. But again, what is the truth? And since I have mentioned that I believe in something that is beyond just the self's conception of truth, but rather it is something that is independent of its being. And I suppose I should mention that it seems likely that in terms of truth that the self is related to the process of discovery, and that within the network of different conscious entities, I think there is, within the notion of truth, a rather complex subculture of situations. And I think these situations are unique to the conscious being. For we can create a complex web of relatedness, of intelligibility. We can design ourselves institutions, corporations, hospitals, schools, many different types of organizations, such that we are related to each other in certain ways. And by our relation to each other in certain ways, there are certain things that are brought to the world. Of a corporate entity, it is quite a giant that moves through the world, that has profound impacts on the environment, perhaps positive, maybe negative. Of schools, we have large institutions for which the mind of the young are shaped and molded to match some conception of the world, of reality, such that they can participate in the structure that has been produced. And there are always questions about goodness and evil relative to the culture that man, or the structure of society that man has created. And I wonder at the subtlety of this distinction of truth and lie within this system, within the system of rules and regulation, of different boundaries made by man that may be false by his conception, boundaries that may be fundamental by his discernment. Now I had to pause for a moment as my cat has decided to join us, sitting on my lap. But as I was saying, I think what is highlighted there is that distinction of man's existence. That is, he has this agency in his will to believe and to do what he pleases. And because of this, although he is constrained by certain fundamental forces, no doubt, he is open to making these mistakes, committing these lies, believing in false goods, etc. And it is just as likely that he may believe in a true good as he is to believe in a false good. Now surely, I think it ought to be less likely for a man that commits himself to piety or piousness to have that probability shifted, such that he is more oriented towards the true nature of things, true goodness, rather than towards falsehood. But of course, a lie is indicative of one that understands what the truth is, but chooses to say the falsehood, or what is contrary to the truth. But again, my earlier point stands, that it is possible that one can find themselves within an institution, a particular infrastructure, for which the infrastructure we might call a tyranny is the thing that is untruthful, and what is necessary within it is a lie against the truth of the tyranny. And the truth of the tyranny is itself a falsehood. So, under the intelligible sphere of the tyranny, there has been a lie that was committed, but under the intelligible sphere of all that is, there was actually truth that was told. I suppose it is a difficult matter. The getting of treasures by a lying tongue. Now surely there's a way in which we can interpret this that is not lost in the particulars, is not lost in the possibilities. But I suppose half of the fun is imagining all of the potential possibilities, or at least a few, by which we can springboard off of. Now for a moment, although it is simple, what can we say about these treasures? The mind is quick to go to material treasures, the sort of superficial trope, perhaps, of the pirate's treasure chest full of gold. Gold, this material substance for which man can find much potential. He can exchange it for anything that he desires. Food, land, women, alcohol, or something more sophisticated, surely. It doesn't necessarily have to be spent aimlessly towards the lower passions. But surely the story in which treasures are spent on the lower passions is the classic story of corruption. The corruption of man by wealth, by these material treasures. But of course, treasures, just like wealth, or riches and poverty, can extend much more than just the material things. For what would the material be without the intelligible sphere, without the meaning that is endowed to it, without its relationship to some other mechanism? The getting of treasures by a lying tongue. And so here we have this story. It is one of the potential stories of corruption. A lying tongue. That the lie in this case was told against the truth, or the established truth, such that they would receive this treasure. Again, this treasure that could be more than just the material good. It could be position. It could be authority. This position and authority could be institutional in nature. It could be familial. We can insert this into any number of different things at any number or any layer or any level of organization. The getting of treasures by a lying tongue. Now there is more here that I would like to get at, but my mind is a bit clouded. And I think that in order to move forward, I must move past this piece and this part. I think this will come up again. The lying and the treasures, how this is related to the rest of the verse. But for now, I want to leave this behind and move on. The getting of treasures by a lying tongue is a vanity, tossed to and fro of them that seek death. You know, often in my life, I think about the things that are unseen to me. I think about the things that I do in the moment that I am unaware and uncertain of their consequences. And how many of these things, day to day, week to week, year to year, exist. How much of it is outside of my understanding and control. Now, it is not something that I do to lament the fact that I am not in control of many of this, but rather I do find it fascinating, interesting. How much of my life is just out of my control. And again, it's just not as though I would like it to be within my control. But there are times, and I think on the whole, that I do desire to be a bit more discerning in terms of my actions and my behaviors. Again, not so that I can control, but so that I can see what is spread out before me, so that I could choose. And an agent that is, I think, responsible with his will is an agent that can do great good. He is also an agent that can do great evil. That is one of the potential downfalls of trying to understand. And I hear Genesis ringing in the background. However, that being said, this verse I think is one of those things that is showing us an extension, a proverbial extension that I myself, as I mentioned, often think about the end. Where does this behavior exactly lead me? Even if it's just a joke that I'm saying to another person, perhaps at work, how far does this actually go? What does this mean for me? How am I to be judged because of my actions? The getting of treasures by a lying tongue is a vanity tossed to and fro of them that seek death. Now surely this story of corruption in the beginning, for which somebody gets treasure by lying, I think of many things these days, again, for which I am somewhat ignorant of, but have a general understanding, a general conception. I can see the silhouette through the haze. I think of the various financial institutions and all the trouble that they have been in, and all of the deception that must go on there to skirt beneath the law. And it's the skirting beneath the law because there is no concern for the structure of the state or the structure of the society. It is primarily because of the treasure. Their treasure is their highest good. The return on their investment is the highest good. And by whatever means they will resort, they will attempt to continue to worship that treasure, that profit. And that is not to say that profit in every case is bad, but if it is in an inappropriate relationship with the individual, then surely it can be a bad thing. And I think this deceptive relationship between the state and those in large hedge funds, for example, or large banking institutions. Again, it's not all, but the ones that we are mostly familiar with. These are those that attempt to get treasures by a lying tongue. And I don't want to limit this illustration to just that analogy. There are many things that we can imagine in our lives that are this way, not just in terms of our observation, but within ourselves. Again, what I mentioned about the reflection on my behavior and the uncertainty through which, perhaps I should say, my behavior unfolds this judgment in the end. The getting of treasures by a lying tongue is a vanity tossed to and fro of them that seek death. I don't think many of the truly guilty bankers necessarily seek death, but they seek this treasure through a lying tongue, and by extension, through the pattern of this verse, they seek death. And now what I wish to draw is the connection between how that can be, even if somebody is unaware of how their action in that moment, that lying for that treasure, is actually a seeking of death. Such a strange thing. Most people, we would imagine, that seek treasure, seek to live life to their fullest, to its fullest. They are entirely self-absorbed, so they want that self to be completely satisfied, and not to be burdened or to be interrupted by anything else than pure euphoric bliss. And perhaps there is something in that is actually the view or the seeking of death. So let's go into the in-between, a vanity tossed to and fro of them. Now, vanity is a form of pride, is a form of excessive pride. Now, pride being something that we talked about in verse 4, which was an high look and a proud heart, and the plowing of the wicked is sin. There's a lot, I think, that goes into pride, and much of that verse was also one of these extension-type verses, by which pride in the moment can be unassuming. It can be rather inviting, but actually it can be a poison, given a certain relationship to it. Now, I think a humble understanding of one's achievements is not the end of all, but the focus on one's own achievements and worth, I think more importantly, more fundamentally, has such a sinister underbelly that I think at times it is best just to avoid it altogether. Excessive pride in or admiration of one's own appearance or achievements, the quality of being worthless or futile, these are the definitions, immediate definitions of vanity. Now, how interesting that second definition, the quality of being worthless or futile. That's right on the money from what we had described in verse 4 about pride leading to purposelessness and the absence of value, sort of a black hole of value. For something is worthless, it is something that has no value. If something has no value, it has no purpose. If something has no purpose, it has no meaning. If something has no meaning, its being is naught. It is nil. It is akin to death. It is akin to non-existence or non-existence. So what is this image, this vanity, to and fro, if this vanity is to be imagined as this black hole, this sucking in of whatever it is that it is consuming? Can we say that it is consuming value? Perhaps consume is not the right word. Perhaps attack is another word that we can imagine. But still, that is not quite right. It is not consuming value to have for itself. Perhaps we can say that it is attacking value. But that's not quite right. For it may attack it and destroy it. In that sense, it is correct. It may attack it because it views it as an enemy. And perhaps that is correct. But it is not something in and of itself that has a strong existence, a strong being. It is something more that entices it into it, like this black hole analogy. And so it's somewhat of an attack. It's more of a trap, we can say. A pit. And as the psalmists describe the pit of Sheol, this place of darkness, this pit for which the living and the dead go, the dead in the sense that the mind is no longer alight. There's no intelligibility to be had there. The living that go there are, in a paralleled manner, like the dead, in that they do not occupy that potential that the mind offers to view the world and to experience life. They exist there as zombies, so to speak. The getting of treasures by a lying tongue is a vanity tossed to and fro of them that seek death. So again, we are at vanity. And we see it being tossed to and fro. The image that comes to mind here when I think of something that is tossed to and fro is that of a ship that's on a stormy sea. That it is tossed to and fro because of the turbulence that is produced by the attention towards something. Now, this attention is towards chaos. This attention is towards the storm. And because in this world, in this intelligible sphere, within this heavenly sphere, our attention is what truly matters, we create before us, imagistically, sort of like in the natural world, the conditions that are necessary for which a violent storm can befall us. Now, the language here is interesting. By a lying tongue is a vanity tossed to and fro of. That's a key word there, of, meaning it is a part of them. And who are they? They are those that are attempting to get the treasures by lying. And so there's an aspect of these people that are being ravaged by their own attention. That this attention towards vanity that is causing this black hole, that is inviting it to this pit of Sheol, or this darkness, this is death. It is death in the sense that I had mentioned about the pit of Sheol, that there is this parallel between the living and the dead, and that they occupy this unconscious space, much like evil at the periphery, at the margin. And it's not that everything at the margin is evil. but that evil can operate quite well at the margin. It can prey on the less well-oriented. It can prey on those who are unfortunate, again, are unbonded. They are loose in this intelligible sphere. Their attention easily corrupted. Much like the margin, I think one has to wonder about this chaos. And it seems to me that just like the margin, chaos is something that's fundamental to our experience here. Just like falsehood or evil, or of the positive end of those things, it's all interacting together. Now this complete disorder and confusion, that is chaos, it's much like the margin, because at the periphery things are not as ordered as they are at the center. Now for man, it doesn't necessarily mean that the order at the center is good for man. And I think that there are cases in which false order can lead to disorder, can lead to the pushing away from the center to the margin. The case of man certainly complicates it, but his faith in that transcendent being, that agent that is the through line through it all, that allows us to establish something that is actually worthwhile and truthful, I think is the thing that gives a true constancy to the variability that is the center of man and then the periphery of man. And when I say that, I mean the center is a reflection on man's culture or civilization at any given point, and that at the center of it we have the institutions that are in control or in power. And it's not just power, it's authority, it is position, it is ability to have influence over. And I suppose that there is some power in positions of authority, but it's not exercised solely as a matter of power. I think that culturally we can identify a spirit that goes along with a certain culture, but it's not necessarily a power that is within the hands of man. This sort of thing is independent to a degree. Its agency is because of man's interaction. Now, I think there are ways of organization for which the agent that is culture can quite heavily be influenced by a few. But that is neither here nor there. The point that I'm trying to make is that centerpiece, the opening in the fabric. There's an example here. I don't want to use the word reality, but there's an opening in the the confusion that is this chaos. There's an opening of sanity. There's an opening for man to tie himself down to something. And when he is tied down, when he finds his sense, he is oriented. He knows his way home. And there is nothing quite like the experience of being lost and then finding one's way again. Finding one's way such that they know how to get home. They know how to get to a place that is safe. But it's not just safe. It is a place that they can be at ease. But it's still more than a place that they can be at ease. It is a place that they belong. And I think there's an aspect of man, every man, that has this either longing for a home, whether it be physical or not, I don't think it matters, but he has this familiarity and this thing, this pillar around which he is bound to keep him sane. And in cases of insanity, obviously, this is something that is quite untouched. It is dissolved. Within it all, within all of the variability, man finds solace and his hearth within that conception of God, I think. The conception of God and his agency can vary among the perspectives of different people. And certainly, as I've discussed before, the perspective of man is one of the things that we have to consider when we consider a God, because ultimately it is through our perspective that we have a relationship with it. It is ultimately through our perspective that we see the natural world, despite having the capacity to see beyond what our natural senses can afford. One can imagine that if they focus on something that is the chaos, that is the thing that moves towards the margin and away from the center, that is this domicidal force, then what they are uncoupling is everything. They are uncoupling man from home. They are uncoupling sanity from the mind. They are uncoupling the self from the world. They are uncoupling the mind from the body. They are moving to a true state of dissolution. And at this point, at the point in which I imagine in a biological example, if something decays, it is sort of reabsorbed by the earth. It is broken down by the various microorganisms, and the various elements are spread about the earth again to be recycled and reused. This is that process of decay, the worship of chaos, that ultimately leads to the death of the mind that attentively worships that aspect of life. And so I think that is the last parallel that I would like to draw, or conclusion that I would like to draw for this verse. The robbery of the wicked shall destroy them, because they refuse to do judgment. The robbery of the wicked. Now, I've had an issue with the Proverbs before, in terms of my reading and my interpretation of it. There was a verse that was quite similar to this, in terms of its grammar, the robbery of the wicked. And what I had trouble with was the word of. The robbery of the wicked. Now, is it that somebody is taking from the wicked because they are wicked? Or is it robbery that is a part of the wicked, that is within the collective that's occurring, that the wicked are committing the robberies? Now, I think it is the latter, that it is the wicked that are committing the robberies. So if we just take this as it is, the question is, why then are the wicked destroyed? Because they refuse to do judgment. Now, if a wicked person decides to rob, they have committed a judgment. Now they've committed a false judgment. They have judged that their behavior is appropriate for the given situation because they think that the reward is greater than the risk. And in their scale of justice, it doesn't matter necessarily if somebody's rights or property is violated. It means nothing to them that they are these predatory creatures. Now, certainly it means something for the society as a whole, but the society cannot exist as a predator within itself. It can exist as a predator among other societies, but certainly not within itself. That harkens back to the last verse about the chaotic element, the marginal element destroying the center that leads to death. I think much is the same here. But what I don't necessarily understand is why the language is because they refuse judgment. Now, I think the reason that this is here, it is not an internally focused verse. It is an externally focused one, which may seem counterintuitive, but an externally focused judgment on the part of an individual would require an internal beginning. It would require a sense of empathy that reaches out forward and out into the court of justice, the metaphorical court of justice, the divine court of justice. And as it does this, as it reaches out, it asks for something in its grasping. What it asks for is a judgment upon itself. And by the understanding of that judgment given by that which is outside of itself, it may understand what it means to be judged. It may understand what it means to truly do right and truly do wrong. Not just pretend to know because there is a law that says this or that. That they are truly educated in the matter of doing right and wrong. That true rightness and wrongness doesn't necessarily come from the surface. It comes from the core. It comes from the very connection of being to reason and to the heart. So much like in the last verse, the insular who choose the self and nothing else but the self push away quite a lot. It is almost as if one is to accept the external chaos as their God, as one is to say they are going to self-actualize, to rotate around the self being the divinity in this case. I don't think there is much difference. The self is not a self-sustaining ecosystem. It is something that is dependent upon many different things. And since it is dependent upon many different things, if it is necessarily cut off from all of those other things, then it will deteriorate and die. Hence, I think, this destruction. And the destruction comes from the denial of that which is outside of itself. And again, much like in the last verse, they are left upon this ship of vanity that is being tossed to and fro. And what they are truly seeking is death. They are seeking an ending. They are seeking an ending under the guise of satisfaction. It's such a strange thing. It's a chaotic thing to think that satisfaction can be so deceptive as to the very thing that causes man to feel at peace, at times, I should say, superficially at peace, or temporarily at peace, can also be the thing that leads to his undoing. And as I've talked about the hearth before, how subtle a thing it is to find the hearth for which the true divinity lies. It's as if a man must turn over every stone, but only one may he find that true belonging. The way of man is forward and strange, but as for the pure, his work is right. Now, I believe I said forward there. The word is froward. And that word froward means of a person difficult to deal with or contrary. Now, what I find interesting about this verse is that we begin by speaking of the way of man. That is this totalizing view of man, and that his way is froward and strange. And then it makes the spectral argument, but as for the pure, his work is right. And so immediately what I question is that if man and his existence is froward, if it is just sort of fraught with this difficulty, and it has within it this contrariness, how then can the purity emerge from this? What is the relationship that man has to this purity relative to his condition of that totalizing frowardness? Now let's talk about the word strange. I also want to talk about the word froward, but strange I think is an interesting one. Strange is one that implies boundary. And much of the Proverbs thus far have been dealing with boundary. These verses are coming together to form sort of a map of intelligibility, a map of this sphere of the conscious mind as it is interpreted through the symbolic architecture. Now from the Latin, we have the word extraneous, which means outside, unfamiliar, distant. This evolved over time to give us the word strange, which can mean odd, it can mean bizarre, unusual, or surprising, something that's difficult to understand, again, unfamiliar. The concept of strangeness is itself, of course, strange. It is distant. Of course, the word represents something that is that thing. So, of course, as I conceive of it, when I think of the strange, when I think of the outside, I get this feeling. It's a particular feeling. It's not necessarily negative, it's curious. It's bizarre. Liminal. It's on some threshold, it is on some boundary. Marginality is another word that I think I used recently, and that comes to mind as well. But as we are discussing the Proverbs, and as it has been forming this map, what I begin to appreciate and to respect is the relatedness that it is all trying to highlight. Now, the relatedness of what? Well, among human society, of the individual, certainly, the relatedness of the different components of mind together to form coherent self, a self that is properly aligned with the world, a self that is not overly internalized such that it is deceived by its own delusion, but also not entirely self-sacrificing to the point where any danger or any feeling has no bearing on the existence of the being, and therefore it comes at great risk to that being. Not that I think the stereotypical example of strange or the outside is to imagine a city or a town, a small town. And I like to imagine in the ancient world that this town or city has some walls around it. These walls are its defensive barriers. On the outside, it is not necessarily the case that everything on the outside is bad. Of course, we have our suburban communities that live on the outside, even in the ancient world. We have our farmland that exists on the outside. But we also have the danger that exists at the periphery, which I think is commonly associated with the margin. It's commonly associated with perhaps the strange. We have people from different cultures that occupy the boundary, or the extraneous. Different cultures, different peoples have different ways of doing, different ways of seeing, and that makes it unfamiliar. Perhaps their proximity is by nature distant, and that also makes it a bit strange. That our relationships are developed by a degree of proximity. Our neighbors, our loved ones, they live closely to us. I think there is both great temptation and also great concern for the potential dangers, but also the potential wonders that exists at the periphery. Now, this example of the ancient city I don't think is the only thing that we can consider. This pattern, I think, can be applied. It is one of these cosmic patterns that can be applied to many different things. We can apply this just as much as we can apply it to an ancient city as we can apply it to a family. That within a home, for example, within the family unit, there is this strong cohesion, there is this bondedness, and that what is strange, what is odd, what is bizarre, is perhaps an event or an individual, an experience, a conversation that lies outside of something, that lies outside of the regular way. Now, within this conversation about the way and the regular way, there's a lot there. There's a lot of questions about, well, is it the right way? Is it the wrong way? Where does the way fit in the broader context of the different principalities, we might say, or things that we can identify that have this cohesion, spirit of their own? Family being one, a city being another, the self being another. That's another interesting example to imagine what is strange to the self. For one has to appreciate and recognize, understand on some level that there is a center to the self. And again, the same questions sort of are brought forth here as to the exact constitution of a self. Not only of myself, of the existing constitution, but what the constitution ought to be. And I think in some sense it's difficult to imagine an individual's constitution because partially, I think, because of the variability. The variability of the self and his or my relationship to other selves and also other things. I can think of the constitution of this pen. I can think of what would be strange for this pen. That would be of the outside of it. And the thing that I could consider to be strange for this pen, or unfamiliar, distant to its composition, would be that if it was broken in half, that would be a bit strange. Perhaps if the pen was shaped oddly, I would imagine that to be strange. But that example doesn't quite fit with what I'm explaining here, because the pen that I hold in my hand now is of a particular constitution. Now we can imagine at a certain level of all pens that they all share probably a fairly common set of characteristics for which we can identify that it is something that is a pen. I can imagine an object that is quite unpen-like, and yet somehow it satisfies the distinction of being a pen that is beyond my understanding, and that would be a strange sort of thing to me. Certainly it would be a strange thing to the category, just as a man can occupy a family, but not every man can occupy that family. It would be quite strange if any man off the street was invited into the house. In some sense it might be enduring, but in other cases it might be dangerous. And what comes to mind here is not just the center and the margin, but the boundary between them. Now, in the case of the city, the boundary is quite clear. It is the walls of the city. I suppose, in terms of the self, there is somewhat of a clear boundary. Perhaps not as clear as the physical city. But even as I reflect on it more, the physical city cannot just remain the physical city in this analogy. There is more to a city than just its physical structure. What makes it a city is the occupation and the goings on within the city, the way of the city. But at least the walls, I think, in the analogy afford the reflection that there is some clear, distinct boundary, even if the city doesn't end at the city gates. There is this aspect that if an enemy were to be on the horizon, those at the periphery who truly belong to the city would come within it for its protection. And in such cases, when it is faced with this threat, we really begin to see the distinction of the inside versus the outside. And it's an interesting thought, I suppose, that depending on the situation, the boundaries of a city change. Now one can posit, is it the case that the boundaries are there, unspoken, whereas in times of danger everybody understands that they can fly within the walls of the city for protection, for safety, whereas in times of peace, as I've said, this understanding goes beneath the surface. Everybody knows that they can go back to the city, but at the same time, they all understand that if they are at peace, there are things and business that must be attended to without the city, such as the merchant class that travels. It could be an army that leaves the city. It could be the farmers that do and conduct business. It could be any number of things. So back to the original reflection. The question is, do I think that the boundaries of the city are altogether the same under every circumstance, or do I think that the circumstance affects the boundaries of the city? Now, I'm leaning towards the latter. That is, the circumstance affects the boundaries of the city. Because, interestingly, I think there's two paths that we can go here. One is that just because an event occurs, it will require the individuals at the periphery to make a decision whether or not they want to go to the city or not, or risk the danger in their fields, defending themselves if an army approaches. In that case, they wish to extend the boundary to themselves, or rather, to that place in the periphery beyond that more definitive boundary. And here I think we see a layer, and this layer is more superficial. It is skin deep. It's not necessarily, if there's a blow to a fortification that's without the city, it is not a blow to that which is within the city. It's not the main city center. It's not the economic heart. It's not the totality of the citizenry. There are many principled aspects of the city that remain intact, even if there is a component that is sacrificed at the periphery or at the margin. And even within, bizarrely enough, this entire distinction, if we spread out the boundary to encapsulate everything that can be considered part of the city, not just the more obvious low-hanging fruit of the city wall that is the boundary, that protector of the city, but again, of everything that occurs without the city, which can be additional fortifications, it could be commerce that is conducted outside of the city walls. Even within the city, I think about in the Peloponnesian War, in many wars, there are individuals that are on both sides. You have the individuals that are adherent to the culture and the society that they are from, and there are other individuals that probably have an aspect of them that loves their home, loves their city, but would wish that they were under the care or rule, or perhaps even tyranny of another society or civilization, perhaps because of their own gain or because of some righteous reason, who knows. But the reason that I bring that up is because it highlights, I think, an even more intense version of this liminality within, the marginality within. And the strange reflection, no pun intended, is that it would seem that marginality, that strangeness, exists at every level, regardless of our care and our desire for stability and security. Now, I don't consider it to be to a degree such that there can be no thingness at all. Of course, there must be something that constitutes something, despite variability in its being. And again, I refer to the city as an example of that. That of the defectors, or of the outlaws, as the Athenians referred to them as, those of the city that wish to subvert it for the people or the invaders that are coming in. And when I say variability in its being, I mean that aspect, that outlaw aspect, is something that is within it. It is a margin that is within the center that threatens to upend the center, that turn it inside out into something entirely different, which would mean, in this case, to place it under the rule or under the thumb of another city-state in the example of ancient Greece. Now, when we transfer this analogy to the self, I think it becomes more interesting. It becomes more personal. And I think most people of a certain age will have gone through this. Those of us who are lucky enough to have stayed healthy through it, I think, are afforded a particular view of this experience, and that is much like the example of the Peloponnesian War, or just in general, the Athenian domination of Grecian society, and that whole interaction between the different city-states, the Confederates and the Peloponnesians, and that conflict that arose after the war with the Persians. What's fascinating is that within the self, again, there are two paths I think we can go here. We can go down the good path and the negative path. Every single one of us has this constitution, this principle of selfness, that we are allowed to understand ourselves, that we are to a degree at peace with who we are, because we recognize certain boundaries around the self that make us who we are. In some sense, these boundaries are akin to the city wall. In some sense, these boundaries are akin to supports that one would have at the base of the house. Strong iron beams or wood beams that supports everything that is on top of it. When these boundaries or these supports are threatened or called into question, I think what necessarily follows is a period of instability, a period of unfamiliarity, a bizarre period of life, an odd period of life, a period of outsideness in which the self is perhaps dissociating from a previous way of understanding and being. I think of the term born again as if somebody is truly born again, their whole relationship to the world, to reality changes. Their outlook on life changes. Core pillars of who they are changes. Of course, not everything changes. Even when a city is captured by another, there are many elements that remain the same within the city. But the longer the city is under the thumb, a certain cultural thumb, the changes begin to take hold. But that initial violence, that initial turbulence, or again in verse 6 this comes to mind, that lying tongue, that vanity that is tossed to and fro. Not necessarily vanity in this case, but that to and fro-ness as a ship that is upon the sea in a storm. Like Noah in his ark, with all of the animals and the understanding of the world that he had left behind. The world that was consumed by its own periphery, by its own marginalized aspects. That which should have been kept at the fringes came towards and into the being of the city. This Sodom and Gomorrah, this corruption, this financial corruption, this sexual depravity. That again, even within the city we will find corruption, we will find sexual depravity, but it will not be to such a degree that the entire society, the entire city is exhumed by it. It is only in extreme cases where this takes place. And in those extreme cases when the negative aspect of marginality, I think it's important at this point to recognize that I think that there are positive aspects to marginality or strangeness and negative aspects to strangeness. When the negative aspect consumes the center becomes negatively strange, negatively odd, negatively bizarre, negatively unfamiliar. Unfamiliar in the negative sense, meaning that it is dangerous, that it has the capacity to destroy, that it is a vanity tossed to and fro of them that seek death. Now, I want to comment on a few things here. I want to get to the word froward, which I know that I've touched on a little bit, but there's more that I would like to say about it. Before we get into that, though, I would like to say that this pattern of verse is not something that is new. There's something quite familiar in this verse to me, although I can't remember what verse in that chapter this pattern had occurred, but I know for certain that this is a recurring pattern. Not necessarily in terms of the strangeness, but in terms of the usage of the word strange, but rather in the use of the word froward and the way of man. What I've seen before is an establishment of man's way, and in this verse it is froward and strange. In chapter 20, just my immediate visual gaze here, there is the verse 24. Man's goings are of the Lord. How can man then understand his own way? And then again, in chapter 21, the verse that we are currently on, the way of man is froward and strange, but as for the pure, his work is right. There's a lot of relatedness between these two verses and others that have focused on the word froward. For there is this question that continually comes up that is slowly being answered about the inability of man to see what he wants to see everything that is before him, to understand the world that is beyond his perception, to understand the world that is within his perception, but also utilize all of that information such that he can come to a greater understanding that will put his existential drive, or perhaps even existential melancholy, at bay. The way of man is froward and strange. This word, froward, and again the word way, that is this path. This path is symbolic of man's experience in totality, his existence. Existence, experience, being, these are difficult matters. There are different stories for which man can tell himself. He can try the best to find his story, given the world that he finds himself in, the reality that he finds himself in. Certainly he can come up with false indications for the story that he is a part of. There are different ways of seeing, such that he is able to determine more accurately and with greater faith, perhaps, the actual story that he is participating in. But his way is froward and strange. He has this aspect of him that resides within him, as I've mentioned about the internal nature of the city, that although the city itself may not necessarily on the whole be corrupt, but it has that marginality within it. And if that marginality were to be replaced at the center, then the city itself would become this exception. It would be the marginal city. And I don't think that the the marginal or strangeness can uphold anything for very long. It is but a temporary place. And this forwardness that exists within his mind, or within man's mind, it has a strange definition, and I have to wonder to myself what the original text, the original word that was used for this. And I don't want to get into too much of a discussion about how translation changes the meaning of things, but surely it's important. The reason I bring that up is because forward in this case often applies to a person, of an individual that is willfully contrary, disobedient, mischievous. The key word here, at least for me, in the definition of forward, is contrary. For man likes to think of himself as made in the image of God. I'm not saying that he is not, but by the same token, when I consider this word forward and I consider the word strange, I consider also the strangeness of man being made in the image of God. For if man is to be of the experience of God, to be an aspect of God, we can say that he has this experiential capacity. His existence is facilitated by various things. We can think of the physical substructure. We can think of the intelligible sphere that his substructure allows him to perceive and to exist in the way that he does, to interface with reality in the way that he does. And in some way, of course, in Genesis, there is the claim that this is somehow related to the experience of the transcendent, that divine logos. And one has to wonder if it is not his freedom of will that causes this antagonism to exist, the perception of the contrariness, the conception of the strange, the conception of anything that is away from the center being that divine peak of the mountain, or whatever. We could just again say divine logos. And that break, or that marginality, seems to us to be so strange. And I think at times vast portions of people these days, we live in an increasingly globalized world, interconnected world, and I think that our diseases, our psychological diseases, will be shared. And eventually our linguistic barriers will be much less, and I think that our diseases will pass much faster. But perhaps also our cures for such diseases will be much faster as well. But why bring this up? It's because of this continual reckoning. It's the continual experience of man, the step and misstep, the mistake and correction. Within there, we find that forwardness, we find that contrariness, we find the strangeness of his existence. Although he be an aspect of that which is divine, he is still a mortal being. He is finite. He is imperfect. And I think because his mind can imagine something that is perfect, he himself is always against this thing. He is always living. His experience is always against death. His life is against death. That there is this juxtaposition about him. We can say that there's a bit of irony in his experience, in his situation. But we have to also wonder if this is not just some selfish delusion. And that understanding and recognition that he is but an aspect of a broader whole, and that there is some intelligible underpinning to the world that he doesn't understand, and again that he is but an aspect of this, and that when his experience is over, there is a possibility that the transcendent mind, for the lack of a better term, will appreciate and remember his experience and his existence, however small it may seem. But much like the human experience, I think there are many things for which go on within our own bodies that are beneath the surface, and yet we interact with that experience in some way. On some level, it shapes our behavior, shapes our actions. There are no shortage of different receptors that allows us to interact and perceive the world. Sometimes these receptors become pathological, and we are acutely aware of their dysfunction. But when they function appropriately, we don't pay much mind to them, much attention to them. We go about our day and we accept them as part of our experience. Perhaps much like this, the human being is sort of like a receptor to that ultimate thing, that ultimate connector of the network. Or, like, in a more significant sense, that the heart and that rational part of the mind, the spirit of man, all of these things that are encompassed by his fascinating cognitive capacity, if we were to separate out the heart and call that man's experience, it would be quite strange. It would be much like an animal. There would be a lot of feelings involved. There would be a lot of instinct. There would be some will and some direction. But largely beneath this centralized whole that is the self, that is maintained partly due to its safety and partly from its continuity of various elements. The way of man is froward and strange, but as for the pure, his work is right. Now, what does that mean in the context following such a strange, no pun intended, first half? That we have established some way of man that has this marginality built in within it. And then it's followed by, but as for the pure, his work is right. It seems like a contradiction in terms. For how can a man be pure if his way is froward and strange? Well, if we are to take this in a literal manner, there must be some way in which purity can exist within the state of man despite his frowardness and his strangeness. Almost as if we are saying that part of his natural way, his experience, can only be so pure. It cannot reach certain heights. Now, whether this is right or not, it's hard to say, but at least at the base level, at the level of hardware that we have that is tampered with, that we have not epigenetically made leaps and bounds to expand our faculties, that we remain in the state that we are now. It seems certainly reasonable that man's purity at this stage would have to necessarily involve that marginality, that peripheral experience. It would have to involve that which is contrary. It would have to involve that which is false. A strange thing to bring into purity. Because purity is this notion of cleanliness, free from, liberated from the falsehood, liberated from sin, perhaps. But again, this is part of man's experience. He cannot be liberated from sin unless he knows every single thing to be known ever. The past, the present, the future. And so this word purity perhaps may not be the best placed here, but at the same time it is prompting us to consider the condition of man relative to his stage or his condition of perfection. But as for the pure, his work is right. What does that mean? His work is right. Now, today I was talking to somebody that was very happy with what they do for a living. And I think many of us, if we were to think about working 7 days a week for over 10 hours, that would seem crazy. Again, it would seem strange. It would seem peripheral. But for those of us who consider this to be peripheral and strange, we work perhaps 40 hours at most, but if we had been in the situation where we worked 70 hours, we would be absolutely miserable. Because we are the type of person that says, or that doesn't understand what it is like to work 70 hours a week and actually enjoy what they do. There's a type of perfection in there, and it doesn't necessarily mean that out of all 70 of those hours, the individual is happy-go-lucky. There's probably a lot of, or at least some suffering that is in there. There is exhaustion, there's fatigue, surely. Perhaps there are melancholic thoughts. But it is not intolerable. It is, for the most part, an experiential thing. It is not an over-rationalization such that the mind is always trying to consider and justify what it is doing. For a person that truly enjoys their work, what makes it right, I think, is their ease of participation. That they can just keep going and keep going and keep going. Are there limits? Yeah, sure. Again, man's way is froward and strange. But within that threshold that man can say that he is pure within his condition, if he finds himself within a place of experience for which he can be and he can enter that flow state, the less he can be of the froward or contrary and peripheral, I think the better. I have to be careful about the peripheral. I think there's some leeway there. But certainly for contrary, in terms of contrary away from that divine logos or divine peak. The farther man can be away from that, despite that being a fundamental aspect of him. Like I said, fatigue is always going to be there for him. And that contrariness of fatigue is going to go against that ease of being for which one is allowed to work 70 hours a week and still be satisfied without being overworked or overburdened. And so again, in some of this, I think that when we say his work is right, it is also, in a sense, I think, saying that his experience is right, that his participation with the world is right, that he has found himself of such a disposition, despite the frowardness, despite the strangeness, that he can be and exist free of the center being polluted by the periphery, the center being polluted by the contrary. That is, again, the self cannot live with the self. That there is contrariness at the center of the self, such that it is experience and existence itself is torturous rather than blissful. So I think I'm going to end this episode here, and I'll return next time with verse number 9.